Raheem Morris says that the Falcons are a quarterback away. We'll break down why he's both right and wrong.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of the podcast. Shout out to you, Raheem Morris, as another everydayer, explain later in a bit, but all of you, if you want to become like Raheem, and become an everydayer of this podcast, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So on today's episode, we will not be talking about Jonnu Smith's release that occurred Tuesday afternoon. That will probably be something that we'll break down fully on tomorrow's episode. But instead, today, we're going to talk quite a bit about some of the comments made by Raheem Morris at Tuesday morning's presser at the scouting combine this year. And unfortunately, Terry Fontenot's up to his usual tricks, not really saying anything. Maybe at a later date, we'll go into some of the things that Terry, but Raheem out there, not only is he listening to the podcast, but he's contributing to the podcast because he's giving us certain comments that are allowing us to do an entire episode, breaking it down, right? He's talking about we're getting a quarterback that's best for our city. Everybody's going to read into that. That is a conversation probably for another day. But, with Raheem, I misspoke earlier this week. I said like Raheem and Terry are going to talk on Thursday. They talked today on Tuesday, right? And two things that Raheem Morris said on Tuesday that jumped out to me. First off, he mentioned that the Falcons have options A, B, C, and D as far as the quarterback position goes. And that is Raheem outing himself as an everydayer of this illustrious podcast because we constantly talk about, we don't say options, but we say plan A, B, C, and D for the Falcons at quarterback. And if you've been missing those episodes over the last 2 months, plan A is trading up for a quarterback. Plan B, as I propose, is signing Kirk Cousins in free agency. Plan C is settling for QB4 at 8, potentially, which is Michigan quarterback, JJ McCarthy. And plan D is trading for Justin Fields. And we've also talked about plans E, F, and G, Russell Wilson, Baker Mayfield, Carson Wentz, etc. Right? We've mentioned how that would mean that, things have gone horribly awry for the Falcons this offseason as far as their quarterback position if they were getting the plan E, plan F, and plan G. So, I want to, again, acknowledge my everydayers, including Raheem Morris, who's proving himself, by going options A, B, and C, just like D. Okay, like that's the ones that we've been talking about, going to D. And once you get past D, all things are problems. So shout out to you, Raheem, now that I know you're listening. But the second more important thing that he said is that Raheem basically acknowledged and echoed the sentiments that a lot of people have been echoing elsewhere in the world, that the Falcons are a quarterback away, right? He talked about how he likes the Falcons' ability to compete right away because of the great job that Terry Fontenot and company have done building up the offensive line, adding playmakers like Bijan Robinson, Drake London, and he didn't forget Kyle Pitts this time, like he did at his introductory press conference. And basically he said, now we got to go out there and get a trigger man, referring to getting the quarterback. And then later he said, if we had better quarterback play last season, I might not be standing here right now, referring to the fact that basically his predecessor, Arthur Smith, lost his job essentially because of Desmond Ridder. Now, we've talked before about the narrative and notion that is going to be pervasive this offseason that the Falcons are a quarterback away. And basically, Raheem Morris was pushing that in these comments. And it's why you've heard increased buzz as of late that the Falcons are going to be aggressive when it comes to fixing their quarterback position because of the perception that this is by far, and it is, the biggest problem and often the only problem that the Falcons have. Now, I personally don't push that narrative that it's the only problem of the Falcons. It's certainly the biggest problem that they got to deal with, right? I certainly agree. Are the Falcons a quarterback away from being a playoff team? Sure. If you drop the top 10 quarterback, you put Matt Stafford, you kidnap Matt Stafford, and you put him on the Falcons right now, would the Falcons have made the playoffs last year? Sure, absolutely. Are the Falcons a quarterback away from being a true blue contender? Right? And it depends on what you think contending means, right? But I think contending is basically being a team that's a legit threat, if not a favorite to be considered that they're probably going to get past the second round of the playoffs. I don't think the Falcons are a quarterback away from that, right? And part of that is I don't know if the quarterback I'm not a person that believes the quarterback solves all your problems. I think the quarterback solves one problem, the biggest and or hardest problem that you need to get solved, but it's still at the end of the day one problem. But it's often framed in the way that, like, this is your biggest problem, this is your hardest problem to solve, and you need to solve that problem first, and everything thereafter is easy. I don't think everything thereafter is easy. It might be easier, but if it was easy to fix your run game, to fix your offensive line, to fix your defense, then we wouldn't be talking about all the teams in the world, including the Atlanta Falcons, that need to fix those problems year after year, right? And I think Falcon fans know this better than anybody, right? We had a quarterback for a decade and a half, and it didn't solve the run game. It didn't solve the offensive line. It didn't solve the defensive problems. Even if you go back to the previous quarterback and Michael Vick, same thing, right? Now, it wasn't the run game that was the problem. It was the weapons, right? But still, the offensive line and defense were issues back then. And my worry about the Falcons with this mindset of being a quarterback away is that they sort of don't look at the team in their division, the Carolina Panthers, that got so caught up in where we've been in quarterback purgatory for a couple of years, and we're going to ignore all of our problems and make that big, bold move to go get the quarterback. And guess what? The people that made that move got fired. They didn't last more than a year after making that move. And my fear is complacency, right? That was what doomed the Falcons for the decade and a half that Matt Ryan was here, right? We saw this with the Julio Jones trade, over a decade ago, right? Where the Falcons at the time felt like we need this final piece of the puzzle to get us over the hump from being a playoff team to a true blue contender. And to their credit, they got pretty close, right? They were, quote unquote, 10 yards away from the Super Bowl, making it to the NFC Championship game in 2012. And Julio Jones was the primary reason why they got that close, right? The dominance he had in that NFC Championship game against the 49ers in the first 15 minutes was the only reason the Falcons had built a 17-0 lead in that game. But then what happened, right? Julio got hurt. And for the next 45 minutes, the talent disparity between the 49ers and Falcons showed itself. And the 49ers came back and won that game. And the Falcons themselves realized this at the time, which is why their subsequent drafts were less focused on drafting the high character guys and more focused on, we need to get more athletes in this building to close that talent gap, right? That's why they drafted guys like, Desmond Trufant and Robert Alford and Rashid Hageman and Desmond Southworth. They would have never drafted some of those guys, not all those guys, like Hageman and Southworth, 2-3 years earlier than that, right? Just betting on the traits and the upside with those guys. But then what happened was, with the trade to Julio Jones, they gave up all the assets that they needed to close that gap, right? They traded all those away to go get Julio. And don't get it twisted, guys. When we talk about the Falcons going and getting a quarterback, being aggressive and getting a quarterback, trading up in the draft, I'm not sitting here saying that the Falcons shouldn't do that. I'm just sitting here saying that there's a lot more risk involved with that than I think a lot of people that try to, get consumed by this notion of we're just a quarterback away. And they ignore that risk, understandably. And what that could lead to is potential other problems rearing their ugly head further down the road, as it did for the Falcons team back in the day with Julio Jones. But we'll discuss that a little bit later. But for, as we continue today's episode, let's assume for now that the Falcons are a quarterback away. And let's discuss what are the odds that they get that quarterback that's going to solve so many of their problems, right? Now, the odds aren't good, so trading up is inherently risky, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Football season may be over, which means basketball season is here and now, and that means you guys can get buckets with your first bet at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. You can bet on NBA, NCAA with March Madness right around the corner, whether it's quick bets, live same game parlays, player props, so much more is available. You can bet on the upcoming NFL draft. You can bet on NHL. I'm sure there's horse racing and Basquiat and curling and other things that FanDuel has you covered. All you got to do to check it all out is go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to shoot your shot. FanDuel is an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. And guys, I want to tell you that today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. And a lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had more time. I know if I had more time, I'd be grinding more of that film. But how would you use your extra time? Better way is to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. And therapy can help you find what matters to you so that you can do more of it. Now, therapy has benefited me in a lot of ways. It's taught me coping skills like you can only control what you can control. I can't control whether or not the Falcons draft a quarterback, whether or not the Falcons win on Sundays. But the things I can't control is the quality of this podcast, right? And that's the thing I tend to focus on. And if you're looking to find those things that you can focus on so that you can deal with whatever life is giving you, check out BetterHelp. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. I highly recommend it. It's entirely done online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist. And then you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons, I want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel, the first of its kind here on YouTube. Locked On is an innovator and icon. And if you're not only looking for, the show that gives you the biggest headlines from all the national leagues and national shows on Locked On Sports Today, if you're looking for, more local flavor, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 streaming channel as well right here on YouTube. So, as we talk about the risk involved with trading up, let me make this clear. I'm not suggesting that the Falcons shouldn't trade up, nor am I suggesting that the Falcons' current roster is trash, right? I just think there's a lot more risk involved with this than, a lot of people would lead you to believe, right? When the Falcons made that all-in move for Julio Jones, 12 years or 13 years ago, the 3 previous seasons prior to making that move, they had won 33 games compared to this year's team only having won 21 games over the last 3 years. So, at least for that team, which was on average 4 wins better than the current team, they were a lot more justified in going all in because they were already pretty high up there, right? And basically the argument I would make is like, if you're using a poker analogy, the current version of the Falcons, before as they push their chips in the middle of the table going all in, like they got like a 7 and an 8 of hearts in their hand, right? That's what they're going all in on. While the 2011 Falcons, at least when they made that Julio trade, had a couple of face cards. Let's say that. So, you're hoping that certain pieces on this roster, like, Drake London turns into Roddy White, Kyle Pitts turns into Tony Gonzalez, that 2011, 2010 defense was already like a top 12-ish unit. And I think this defense is not far from that right now, but, we still got to work our way towards that. Now, if we're imagining, the hypothetical, right? The plan A comes to fruition and the Falcons do trade up to get a quarterback. We did a breakdown earlier this week, Mock Draft Monday, breaking down a recent beat writer mock from The Athletic, where our guy Josh Kendall had the Falcons trading up from 8 to 3, and he wound up giving up this year's first, next year's first, and this year's second round pick in order to make that move. And relatively speaking, that's a small price to pay for a quarterback, right? But if you do pay that price, you're essentially punting on this year's draft, similar to what the Falcons did in 2011 and to a lesser extent in 2012 by trading up for Julio Jones, right? And it's not to say that, with the picks that you're left over, the 3rd and 4th round picks that you're going to be left over, that you can't get good players there, but it's a lot harder to hit on those picks than it is in rounds 1 and 2, right? On average, the hit rate in terms of finding quality starters in rounds 3 and 4 is roughly 20, 25, 22%, somewhere in that range. So even with the Falcons having 3 picks in that range, with the extra pick coming from the Jaguars with the Calvin Ridley trade. So they have 2 picks in round 3 and 1 pick in round 4. You got 3 picks in that range, but the odds are that you'll be lucky to hit on one of those 3 picks based off of that hit rate, right? One of those 3 guys is going to be able to, quote unquote, solve a problem for you in the future by becoming a quality starter. So basically your success in this year's draft class is, in this scenario where we're trading up, is hitting on that quarterback and then arguably being 3 times more effective at drafting than the average NFL team, because I come with that 3 times, because if you have 3 picks in rounds 3 and 4, if you hit on 2 out of those 3, that's a 67% hit rate. And if the average is roughly 22%, that's 3 times better than that. That's where that comes from. But, let's talk about your chances of hitting on the quarterback, right? Which depends on what you measure as a hit on a quarterback. But most metrics I've seen indicate that that's a 20%, as low as 20%, or 40%, as high as 40%, maybe 45% for a first round quarterback. But for sake of argument, let's round it up to 50%. Let's say it's a coin flip on whether or not when you draft a quarterback in round 1, that player is going to turn out to be this sort of nebulous hit in that regard. And let's assume that this is a 4 quarterback draft with that 50% hit rate. And, Caleb Williams of USC, Drake May of North Carolina, Jaden Daniels of LSU, and JJ McCarthy of Michigan are the 4 quarterbacks that most people that cover the draft. And again, now I know every fan doesn't think this way, but I tend to not pay attention to what, making Falcon 87 things about the draft, as opposed to the Dane Bruglers and the Daniel Jeremiahs and the Mel Kipers of the world. No offense to making Falcon 87. And if that is actually someone's screen name, I apologize. I was just coming up with what is a generic handle in my mind. But if there's 4 quarterbacks in this draft, 50% hit rate, 2 of these guys are going to be good. And if you're like many of these people that think one of those guys is going to be Caleb Williams, that basically means, if you're the Falcons or really any other team looking to draft a quarterback early in, you have a 1 in 3 chance of hitting on that other quarterback, on your quarterback. And when you think about it, like, we've seen a lot of drafts that had 2 quarterback hits, right? And again, it depends on what your definition of what a hit is. But it's been a while since we've seen a single draft produce 3 good quarterbacks, right? Like, if you go recent memory, like 2020, you can say Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert. Is Tua a hit? I don't know. Time will tell, I guess. We'll find out a year from now, right? 2018, you can say, okay, Lamar and Josh Allen were hits, but is Baker the 3rd best quarterback in that draft? 2016, okay, that produced Jared Goff, Dak Prescott, and Carson Wentz. Like, are all of those 3 guys hits? They all got second contracts. 2 of them, those teams lived to regret that second contract, in the Rams and Eagles very shortly after giving those money. So, like, to me, like, probably the last draft where you could definitively say had 3 or more hits in was maybe 2012, if you count Andrew Luck as a hit. We definitely count Russell Wilson as a hit. Kirk Cousins, is he a hit? Is Ryan Tannehill a hit? I don't know, right? But it's basically, the point being, it's rare to get 3 good quarterbacks in the draft. That kind of speaks to, what I'm saying is, like, we'll probably get 2 good quarterbacks out of this draft in all likelihood, rather than 3. So, before you guys accuse me of being Mr. Drew, being that negative Nancy, and talking about why, it's a trade up is not going to work. My point more is just like, if you're trading up, you're more likely to find the next Baker Mayfield, to Ryan Tannehill, or Carson Wentz than anything, right? Those are some of the more favorable outcomes when it comes to who the Falcons could get at the quarterback position. I know we all have dreams of landing, that star quarterback or whatever. You're hoping that maybe you hit on the second best quarterback in this draft class. And if you compare, Baker's draft class, that would probably be Lamar after Josh Allen, right? And Tua's draft class, that would be Herbert after Burrow. And Tannehill's draft class, Luck or Wilson is QB1, QB2, depending on what time frame you're looking at. Today probably Wilson is QB1 and Luck is QB2. But 6 years ago, that may have been a different conversation. Right. And then from, Wentz's draft class, I think Dak is QB1 and Goff is probably QB2 from that draft, but I'm sure some people might flip that. But for me, when it comes to trading up, right, and hoping that you land one of these top prospects, right, probably the QB2 or QB3 in this draft, in all likelihood, again, depending on what you think about Caleb Williams, I think it makes sense to swing for the fences, right? If you're going to trade up, if you're going to give up these assets, go big or go home, right? Because if you're already going to punt on this draft, then you better make sure that you get the quarterback out of it that makes it worthwhile. That if you're only going to get like 1 decent player out of this draft class, then you better get a quarterback that more than makes up for all the lost assets that you have. And in my opinion, that player to me that is, going for the home run is Drake May. I know there's a lot of people that think, it could be Jaden Daniels, or I'm sure there's people out there that think it's JJ McCarthy or Michael Penix or Spencer Rattler. It's different strokes for different folks. But for me, at least, if I'm picturing the guy that I think is going to be best in a position to outduel a Patrick Mahomes 5 to 10 years from now in a conference championship game or in a Super Bowl, I think Drake May is the guy that I would be willing to bet on beyond Caleb Williams, right? Because again, assuming Caleb Williams is going number one, but we'll see. I know Peter King, shout out to you, is doesn't agree with that. So we'll see what develops over the next couple of weeks. But ultimately, whether or not that quarterback becomes that successful player that can go out there and hold his own against Patrick Mahomes in the future, probably boils down to the nature versus nurture debate, right? And we can argue about this all day about this quarterback's nature, that quarterback's nature, as we often do with Drake May versus Jaden Daniels versus JJ McCarthy versus Michael Penix, etc. But ultimately, probably their success is going to hinge on which one of those guys goes to the most nurturing environment that's going to foster that quarterback's development, right? And, when it comes to the scale of nurturing environments, you look at, the 2023 Panthers are at the bottom of the list, and the Falcons are certainly in a better situation than the Panthers were after their trade up. But I don't know if that's the fair standard that we should be setting, because they were down here, right? And I think there's room for improvement for the Falcons when it comes to their environment, and we'll break that down, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So passion, drive, and patience, it's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. But wrapping up today's episode, we talk all about the nurturing environment that it takes to foster a young quarterback. We've spent, the last 2 off seasons talking about that quite a bit. And to me, there are 3 boxes that when you look back at the quarterbacks that have been successful early in their careers, especially as rookies, they have gone to teams that have tended to check at least 2, if not all 3 of these boxes, right? Having a good running game, having a capable offensive line, and having a solid defense, right? Now, the reason why those 3 things matter for particularly a young quarterback is, if you have a run game, it takes pressure off your quarterback in the passing game to carry the offense, right? Early downs, red zone, you can rely on the run game to get you over, the hump, get you past the first down marker, past the end zone, rather than having your quarterback having to do all the work. That you can rely on a veteran quarterback to be able to do that heavy lifting, but a young guy's not necessarily prepped for that. The offensive line is valuable because when you do get in those passing situations, you need to keep that guy upright. Now, some might argue, well, you need to have weapons as well. And that is true. Like, I don't think you can, deal with having nobody to throw to. But I think in general, for young quarterbacks, we've seen more young quarterbacks get ruined by bad offensive line than necessarily not having, elite weapons or anything surrounding them. And then the third thing being the defense, right? That takes pressure off your offense to have to score points, especially if you're going to be relying heavily on your running game, like you often are with your young quarterback, right? Running the football is not going to lead to you scoring 30 burgers every week. Just ask Arthur Smith, right? More likely, even if you have a healthy run game, you're probably looking at scoring maybe 20, 24 points, most weeks. And so you need a defense that can win games 24-20 or 20-17, right? In order to play that way and win and be successful so that that quarterback can continue to get chances, right? You got to win, right? That's the bottom line business in the NFL. And, there's every reason to think that the Falcons do check these 3 boxes, right? We talked about that all season as one of the reasons why we were optimistic about this previous season, because this team checked all those boxes and we're going to be able to put Desmond Ridder in a position to succeed. But unfortunately, those things didn't really go the way that we thought, right? The Falcons had a bottom 5 rushing attack for a large chunk of last season, right? And big part of that was due to the dip in offensive line play. Now, in terms of being able to keep the quarterback upright, I think after the first month of the season, the pass protection was mostly fine. Again, we can nitpick games here or there, single individual bad performances, but overall, we weren't necessarily over those last, 10, 12 games, really complaining about, oh, we couldn't block anybody. And then when you look at the defense, the Falcons defense was good, but I think it was probably closer to league average than probably a lot of other people think, right? But if you're the Falcons, you're hopeful that all three of those areas can improve, right? Especially in the run game and the offensive line, that they will have a rebound type of season in 2024 after a bit of a disappointing 2023. Now, I'm not as confident as I was 6 months ago that the Falcons are going to have this top 5 rushing attack like I did, but they should at least rebound to league average at the very least. And then with the offensive line, if you can improve their depth, I think that will go a long way to really strengthening that unit, because I think they arguably lost 2 games because of lacking offensive line depth. That wasn't the only reason why they lost those games. I'm thinking of the Tampa Bay game and the Panthers game late in the season, right? Quarterback play mattered, but part of the reason why quarterback play was so detrimental in those games was because they couldn't really rely on their run game because their offensive line depth wasn't good enough to operate their outside zone scheme, and that put more pressure on the quarterback to have to carry the offense. And unfortunately for us, Desmond Ridder was not capable of doing that. So while I sit here and I go, swing tackle is a problem that the Falcons need to address. I'm not trying to argue that swing tackle is on the same level as quarterback, right? Quarterback is way up here and swing tackle is way down here in terms of issues and problems that the Falcons need to solve. But my point is that hitting on the quarterback does not make that swing tackle problem go away. That's still going to be an issue regardless of who the quarterback is. And when you look at the defense, we got a lot of holes there. You need new starters at cornerback, new starters at safety, right? You got to place at least 2 starters up front with Calais Campbell and Bud Dupree potentially departing. Now, I'm sure there's some out there like, well, why can't Zach Harrison and Arnold Vachetti fill those spots? Why can't Clark Phillips and DeMarco Hellum solve our problems at cornerback and safety? And I'm like, all right, if you if you're willing to bet on those guys, by all means, do you, but good luck to a team that does that, right? And that's part of the issue with trading up, right? It's similar to how the Falcons in the past had to place bets on Akeem Dent and Peter Kahns and Lamar Holmes and trust in those guys to develop, and they didn't, right? Within 2 or 3 years, those guys were being replaced by Paul Warlow and James Stone and Ryan Schrader, right? And not only are you betting on those guys, you're also betting on some of your ascendant players, the Drake Londons, the Kyle Pitts, the Bijan Robinsons. Those guys have to be stars like Roddy White were, like what Tony Gonzalez was, like what Michael Turner was. Not to mention the Zach Harrisons and the Clark Phillips, et cetera, that are basically role players right now. But now you're going to be betting on those guys to be impact starters rather than role players. You need that to happen if you're going to trade assets, right? And give away those assets, because otherwise those assets potentially will go to solving those problems and getting impact starters and star players at those positions. Now, of course, you still have free agency. Now, of course, free agency, you can still go out there, but your money's going to get a little tighter as you give out premium contracts like you've done for Chris Lindstrom, like you've done for Jesse Bates, potentially you're going to do for AJ Terrell and Kyle Pitts and Drake London in the future. And that's going to squeeze the middle class of your roster. Your roster is going to be all the guys making a ton of money at the top and then a whole bunch of rookies, right? And that's what led to the Falcons. That was a big factor that led to the Falcons being in cap hell, right? Because they weren't hitting on their draft picks. And when they did go out there and sign those middle class free agents, I see you, Jamon Brown. I see you, James Carpenter. They weren't hitting on those. And it's really hard to improve your roster when you're not drafting well, when you're not hitting on the rare cheap free agents that you do have to rely on, right? That's how you get 6 straight losing seasons as the Falcons are in. So, here's the thing. If you have a quarterback, though, you can kind of weather the storm. And so that's why, I'm not anti-trading up, despite all that saying. It's just I'm saying it's not the solution to all your problems, right? But, we all sit here and marvel at the Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes, and we give all their problems are, solved because of Patrick Mahomes. And it's the thing that gets forgotten about the Chiefs is they're really good at solving problems, right? 2020, they lost that Super Bowl. Offensive line got cooked. Overnight, they went out, got 4 or 5 new starters, had one of the best offensive lines in football the very next year. 2021 playoffs, they lose to the high-powered Bengals offense. Well, guess what? They've had one of the best defenses in the NFL the last 2 seasons because they were able to basically fix that problem. That's what the Chiefs don't get credit for. They solve problems. And the key to the Falcons' success is not only hitting on the quarterback, which is a big part of their success under Raheem Morris moving forward, but it's going to be their ability to solve some of these other problems as well. It just won't get nearly as much attention as hitting on the quarterback. So that's what I wanted to say on today's episode. We'll talk more about Jonnu Smith's release in the tight end position, as well as other topics on tomorrow's episode. Continue to check out Locked On Falcons. Check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta. Jarvis is in Indianapolis. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.